Hi, it's Michele Goodwin here, and I am so pleased that you are joining us today for a very important conversation on race, sex, and policing in America. And I'd like to turn it over to Molly Mons, who will join us in starting our program.
Hi, I'm Molly Miller-Mons, and I am the Interim Director of Philanthropy at the ACLU of Minnesota. And as we recognize Dr. King's legacy, Black History Month in February and Women's History Month in March, I am honored to welcome you to our second of 4 conversations where we explore the intersection between women's rights and racial justice. The series titled Advancing Women's Equality, Confronting Barriers to Full Inclusion and Progress has been designed and will be moderated by Professor Michele Goodwin. Today's conversation will center on race, sex, and policing in America. The ACLU of Minnesota has fought to protect the civil liberties of Minnesotans. We are a nonpartisan organization. Our client is the Constitution, not one particular political view. The ACLU of Minnesota has been doing work in the areas being discussed today, including pushing for an end to cash bail because it sets up a different system of justice based on whether or not people can afford bail. This is especially hard for women who, even in this day and age, often bear the bulk of responsibility for childcare. We are also pushing for an end to mass incarceration. Our so-called justice system disproportionately affects people of color from every level, from arrest through sentencing, and through people being more likely to be put back in prison for probation violation. This, of course, affects women of color too. And anytime a woman loses liberty, there's again the risk that it can affect children. Our moderator for today is Professor Michele Goodwin, and she is the Chancellor's Chair in Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute, as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation. A nationally recognized advocate for civil liberties and civil rights, Professor Goodwin serves on the ACLU's Executive Committee and is on their national board, as well as a member of the ACLU of Minnesota's Board of Directors. Her most recent book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood, is available at your local bookstore or library. Thank you, Professor Goodwin.
Thank you for that, Molly. And what a fabulous panel that we have with us today. Now, with any one of them, we could have a full retreat over a weekend discussing these issues. I'm going to give a brief introduction because we've got so much content to cover, and I couldn't be more pleased to just be joined by such wonderful colleagues in the field. So we're joined by Nusrat Choudhury. She is the Roger Pascal Legal Director for the ACLU of Illinois. She was previously the Deputy Director of the ACLU's Racial Justice Program. We're also joined by Amy Fettig. She's the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, and prior to joining the Sentencing Project, she served as the Deputy Director for the ACLU's National Prison Project. And we also have with us Judge Glenda Hatchett. Now, some of you have seen her on television from her show, but she is the former Chief Presiding Judge of the Fulton County, Georgia Juvenile Court and has very special relationship to Minnesota, having served as the attorney representing the family members, the estate of Philando Castile. And we're also joined by the award-winning filmmaker, Deidre Fishel, whose film, Women in Blue, premieres this evening on PBS. So I couldn't be happier to be with you all, although this subject is so weighty. And we're going to have a conversation today. And for those of you who are joining in, you can raise questions up to us and we'll put those to our presenters. We'll do that towards the latter part of this program. But I want to start first with asking you a question, Deidre, which is about your film, Women in Blue, which premieres this evening on PBS. Can you tell us about this film? I understand that it was more than 2 years in the making, and the filming of it stopped around the time of George Floyd's murder.
Yeah. Well, I started the film in 2017 just because of my own outrage at police violence and having stumbled into statistics about the fact that women do use less excessive force. So I came in 2017 never, ever contemplating that the film would end with, just really a symbol of state violence. So it was a long, very tumultuous 3 years, but it was also years in which the women in that police department lost a lot of traction. And I think that's a story that is not as widely known. Chief Harteau, who was the one who welcomed me and gave me the access, was forced to resign 3 months after I got there, after another high-profile officer-involved shooting.
So one of the questions that's coming up today is that in the wake of police reform, because of course we know that policing actually has its roots in American slavery, the original police patrol were actually slave patrols. The badges are virtually identical, which anybody can look up online. And so there are many that are saying, well, why even bother to pay attention to women in policing when the systems themselves need to be reformed? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, there's no question that there's systemic racism in our police departments, and that is, maybe even the most important thing. I think it is the most important thing, but where I think gender plays a really important part is that some of the toxic, aggressive behavior is perpetuated more by men, and that actually isn't about the race of the men. That's a gender thing. And so when I think if the long-term goal is to think about keeping communities of color safe, I do think that we should be thinking about gender, not gender as isolated from other major systemic changes around accountability. And I think women also raises another issue, which is, what do we want police officers to do, and who are the kinds of people that we want to get in there? Right now, you're tested for your speed and your upper body strength. Often women don't do that well in some of those tests. What about requirements that are about empathy, communication skills, and some of that stuff, women as a whole, these are obviously generalizations, do better. They use less force, and that just maybe just because of how women are gendered in our society.
Well, I know that I asked you at an earlier time that we were together about what motivated the film, and you said that in the wake of Eric Garner's murder, you asked a friend who's a police officer, a woman, well, what would she have done? And what was her response?
Her response is she would have said, "Hi, my name is Sally Norris. What's yours? I got a call, and looks like we got to move you." And I just was heartbroken at that, because it's just obviously such a different kind of response.
Well, it raises a number of issues that we'll come back to that relates to this entire conversation, because from the bail system to solitary confinement, to the way that we police and with women and with girls, it's the thick that we're getting into. And so I want to turn to Nusrat, because while at the ACLU National, and I imagine this work is continuing in Illinois, you've been involved with really elevating conversations about how women get policed, this kind of low-level policing, but that has devastating impacts on their lives. And I think that the work that you and Amy are doing at the ACLU really opened up people's eyes to how women experience policing and incarceration. And so I'd like to ask you, how exactly, help explain to our audience, how do race and sex come together in places where people are jailed simply because they don't have the money?
Race and sex come together in all aspects of policing and the criminal legal system, because as we know, institutional racism, institutional misogyny is part of what impacts people's lived experiences. So in the cases of women who are detained pre-trial because they don't have money to post bond, often for very low-level offenses, as well as in the case where women who've been sentenced for very low-level offenses, raising questions about why police are spending time on those offenses at all, things like loitering, things like driving on a suspended license, speeding, that are dramatically over-policed in communities of color. When women can't pay tickets for those sorts of low-level offenses, they're also jailed. I think, Michele, you know about the lawsuit that we brought in South Carolina, where women and men, but mostly women, we found a lot of women in jail, were jailed for 3 weeks to 2 months. 3 weeks to 2 months because they couldn't pay traffic tickets, including women like Shinda Brown, who was jailed for more than 2 months because she couldn't pay a couple of traffic tickets. Now, the fines and fees were so extraordinarily high, in part because state and local governments are trying to raise revenue off of communities, which is in and of itself a huge problem, leading to this kind of distorted policing for profit. But what we saw is when I went into jail, I saw lots of mothers. I saw moms, Black and Latina moms, who were separated from their children, who were worried that foster systems would take their children from them, simply because they were jailed when they didn't have money and they didn't have a chance to go to court to explain to the judge that, listen, I didn't not pay because I didn't feel like it or because I'm shirking my obligations, but I've been trying to figure out whether I can pay my light bill and also pay these tickets to the court. And the human consequences are simply disastrous. And I did want to build off of something that Deirdre said about excessive force too, and the gendered aspect of excessive force. Many of you may have seen the horrific video that became public in late December out of Chicago, where Anjanette Young, a Black social worker, a woman, was at home after a long day of work, serving her communities, doing good, and police raided her house using force. They broke down the door, drew their guns, multiple male police officers, and she didn't have time to even put clothes on. And when they barged in, and she was there naked for a very long period of time while police searched her home, even while she, terrified, pled to them that they had the wrong house, which in fact later out turned to be true. This is the kind of policing we see in America, from the extreme excessive force to the overcriminalization of people because of their poverty, and there are racial and gender impacts to that.
That sounds like what is similar to what happened to Breonna Taylor, and those instances play out over and over again, even though what people presume, what they see in terms of policing, often happens to be very male oriented. I mean, even in the wake of George Floyd's killing, there was Breonna Taylor before that, but what really got people out in the streets was thinking about what happened to George Floyd, even though Breonna Taylor's life was just as valuable. And it's not an either or, it's just that people really do have these blind spots. And it reminds me of the efforts of the Obama administration, because, when Eric Holder first began giving speeches about reform in this area, it was very interesting as I collected the transcripts, that they were all male-centered, not once mentioning women as victims of policing and mass incarceration. And then I collected the transcript of President Obama doing speeches, including the one before the NAACP. And again, he spoke about the importance of looking at these issues from a male lens, looking at what's happening to Black and Latinx boys and men, and women were never mentioned. And so just to give a little bit more background for our viewing audience that's live streaming on YouTube, as well as those joining on the Zoom call, the US incarcerates more women than any other country in the world, more than Russia, China, India combined. The US incarcerates more women. The same is true in terms of juvenile detention and juvenile detention involving girls. And in many states, the theory is that for status-based offenses, the best thing is for girls to be incarcerated. Or if a girl lives in a troubled home where there is domestic violence, better to put her in detention, juvenile detention, which is a horrible thing when you think about it. And so we're going to come back to that, but I'd like to turn to you, Amy, because your work at the ACLU addressed confinement. So what happens once someone is behind bars? And I didn't think that people think much about solitary confinement and what it does to people emotionally, physically, et cetera, but also what that means for women. And so could you express out a little bit about what your research involved and what you found?
Yeah, and thanks, Michele. It is very true that women are always treated as an afterthought. in all aspects of our criminal legal system. This is true in policing, it's true in detention, it is also true in incarceration. And it is interesting that that is still the case because, as you pointed out, we have more women behind bars than any other country in the world by several orders of magnitude. And in fact, the number of women we have behind bars has grown 700% since 1980. Women have been the fastest growing population behind bars since the early 90s. We have absolutely experienced the fallout of mass incarceration. And pathways to incarceration are slightly different for women, but not really. I mean, what we look at when we see the ugly side of mass incarceration, how it is really a product of the fact that we don't have a functioning social safety net, that we use our incarceration system to deal with poverty, deal with a lack of a public health safety net, as we know all too well right now, to deal with the fact that we don't have a functioning mental health system. When we look at women behind bars, that's what we see. We see there people there who for untreated drug problems. We see women there who have serious mental illness who couldn't get treatment in the community, and women who are simply poor. And that is so deeply wrong. But frankly, when we look at women behind bars, we see that those structures of oppression continue. Women's profile in incarcerated settings is actually higher rates of mental health problems than their male counterparts. And unfortunately, they oftentimes in prisons and jails get less treatment. They'll get the worst facilities. They're treated like they're small, docile men. So they're not given specific gender services. Their unique trauma and mental health needs go unaddressed. In fact, I've been to too many prisons where they're using solitary confinement as the mental health unit for women because they don't have a mental health unit for women in the system. So they just dump them into segregation. And of course, the results are disastrous. And we see, frankly, with men and women who are held in solitary confinement, that the highest rates of suicide take place in those units. People kill themselves when they are subject to solitary confinement. They cut themselves, they mutilate themselves. Folks don't do that if they're not in a tortured setting, but we do it to people every single day in America.
So what's the response then to those that would say, well, there must be good reason to place men, women, and even children in solitary confinement? And so can you broaden that out? Because I think that people, there's a way of perhaps not really understanding what happens in the carceral settings in the United States and what those facilities actually look like, especially the ones that house women.
Right, exactly. And, frankly, part of the problem is that Americans have no idea what prisons look like inside. They have a conception that they may have gotten from cable news, but it is not accurate what lives are like in these institutions. And too frequently, they are lives lived in desperation and privation for no good reason. Other than mass incarceration, we have chosen to warehouse people. And we do it with insufficient resources. So we don't have the kind of mental health care we need. We don't have the kind of programming we need. What these institutions are forced to do, because they don't know how to do anything else, and the staff don't have the training, frankly, is they lock people down. I got a problem, I'm going to put somebody in solitary confinement. That is the one size fits all tool that people in corrections have been given by our systems. And unfortunately, it is torture. It is destructive to human beings. But these systems have become very desensitized, frankly, to what they are doing to people. Inhumane systems dehumanize everybody, the staff and the people behind bars. And so what you have is a very toxic mixture. And quite frankly, multi-billion-dollar government institutions that have to retool themselves in order to actually produce good results, but also to treat people humanely.
Okay, so we're setting the foundations for a very rich conversation. And one last slice of it, Judge Hatchett, you've experienced working within the system as a judge presiding over one of the nation's largest juvenile courts in the country. What insights can you share with us from that? And then I'd like to ask you also a little bit about the Philando Castile case. But what insights can you share with us about what that was like as a judge, seeing children funnel in the system? You're muted, Judge Hatchett.
Sorry. There was a big movement in Georgia when I was on the bench, frankly, to try to get me off the bench, because I was really on a mission to try to reduce the number of youth in Georgia who were incarcerated, and actually got the recidivism rate down to single digit, which is unheard of in a major city. And the criticism was that I was coddling these juveniles. No, I'm saying, no, I am trying to rehabilitate them. And so to the point that we're talking about, particularly with the gender issue, so many more girls coming into the system, but also we're seeing horrible sexual assault allegations all over the country against primarily girls, but some boys as well. And there have been some lawsuits, which I'm really pleased to see. But it is such a rippling effect, because a mother, as you're talking about, Amy and others, a mother is incarcerated. The children then come before me in the juvenile court for placement into foster care. You've got 3 kids. Likely they aren't going to be together. I mean, the trauma is absolutely horrific. And so we have got to rethink this. We've got to redo this. And as we're talking about, Professor Goodwin, as you're talking about women and just the attention, we don't talk about Breonna very much compared to others. And we certainly aren't talking about Sandra Bland.
No, that's right. Would have been her birthday over this weekend.
We aren't talking about that. I am right now involved, and I'm skipping around a lot because I know our time is short, but I'm involved right now on the civil side of the case of a homeless woman who was so badly beaten. I mean, it is just horrific. But the police are standing behind sovereign immunity, and it was justified, and it was this, that, and the other. And so I know that these are a lot of topics that we could do a deep dive in. But the fact that women and girls are there, that women are having children in prison, incarcerated with very little care. And we are just talking about in Georgia, the fact that we know that there have been women who have alleged that they got hysterectomies without understanding that they were going to have hysterectomies. And so the myriad of problems spans across the spectrum. And it typically, we're talking about women who are poor, you're talking about women who don't have resources, and then the women who have jobs lose jobs because they can't post the bail. Then their children are in foster care, they lose their housing, then they're out on the streets, and then they get sucked into drug trafficking or whatever it is just to survive, or prostitution. And so quickly I will tell you that I'm involved in an advisory board on a project that really is trying to look at alternatives to incarceration and to make it such that you wear like a Fitbit instead of an ankle monitor, that it will be a lot less money to do that. And we really are trying to see how we can reduce the population, both pre-trial and after sentencing, because too many people are just sitting in jail needlessly, and then generations of suffering because their children then are left out here without a lot of good alternatives. And I have seen too many precious children come into foster care under these circumstances.
And I want to add, and then we're going to have just a broad conversation amongst ourselves. I want to add, and you also have this Minnesota connection with regard to Philando Castile and his family. And although it doesn't address the gender part of this, still that's a matter of policing itself. And it raises the question about when officers do badly, what are the results?
Right. I am, and I promise to make this short because I am so passionate about this. And I'll use Philando's case as a case study. That was the first time, as you know, Professor Goodwin, that there had ever been a police officer in the history of Minnesota who had ever been indicted for a police shooting, ever, 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 ever. And what they said to me is, well, we've never done this before. And I said, but that's not an excuse. And so I pushed hard to get a special prosecutor appointed. I also pushed hard, went all the way up to Attorney Loretta Lynch at the time, thank God she was there, and got a 3-year examination open with the help of the Minnesota ACLU that I will be forever grateful for. This push for the special prosecutor and this push for that special 3-year look. But what I know, and it has not gotten better. And so we know in 2020, there were 1,127 people who were killed. I don't have it broken down by gender, but we know that 28% of those people were Black people. When Black people only make up 13% of the population. In Minnesota, interestingly enough, you're talking about from 2013 to the end of December 2020, that there were 95 people killed by police. The vast majority of them were supposedly unarmed, were armed, 7 were unarmed. They used tasers, but then they killed them. I mean, it just goes on. And so the problem boils down to this, and I'll be through. And I have a slide if Mariah can show you.
We'll try to bring that up.
If we can pull it up, but I will just tell you that 98.3% of killings from 2013 to 2020 did not result in any police officers being charged. I want to say that again, 98.3%. There were people who were charged, but then there were few people who were charged, but then there were fewer people who were found responsible. And so, again, we don't have time, but until, we get beyond the US Supreme Court decisions in Graham and Garner, and then we talk about realistically what happens with this issue of sovereign immunity and the shield that too many police officers have and not being held accountable, we're going to continue to see these trends in this country, and it's not going to change. This qualified immunity is a problem. We know that since 2005, report that was done in May of 2020, that there have been more situations where they have been shielded by this, and that it has gotten worse. And the Court of Appeals have made it very clear as to what the lower federal court should be doing. So I will stop with that, but I am encouraged if we can get some of this legislation done, then I think that we can really see some accountability. And I think
so
it has
to turn to that, right? Because I want to turn to what comes next in this work. And I'll open this up for everybody, because right now there's the effort to try to figure out what's going to work in this next phase. What should it look like? The ACLU has been involved in that, the sentencing project. Deidre, your film shone bright light on here's just a platter of, you can just see 2.5, 3 years of just what goes on behind the scenes. So what do you find in the spaces that you're occupying? What are you advising? Are you talking about abolish the police? Are you talking about, well, let's reform? What does this look like? And then how does it get at these issues involving women and girls? I know that's a whole lot, but anybody can jump in and start.
Well, one thing that I would really like to see, and this impacts on both race and gender, is to get school resource officers, that is police, out of public schools. We know that school to prison pipeline is incredibly real, and it impacts children of color. We know that the resource officers are disproportionately in schools where kids of color are trying to get education, but we also know that disproportionately kids of color are showing up in juvenile detention, which is the feeder for the criminal legal system. So there are, for example, about 15% of the kids held in detention are girls, but Black girls are represented over 3 times more than white girls, and Native girls 4 times more. The disproportionality of who is getting sent from school into prison is enormous. And I know, frankly, from representing kids in the juvenile system for over 10 years, that we would wait for an influx in October after the schools could count kids in the federal census. Then they would start sending them into the juvenile system. It happened every single year. In fact, the people who worked in the juvenile system just waited for the bump in census. They knew that the school was the #1 feeder of children into the system. There's no reason for us to be investing in police officers in schools when we're not investing in, for example, counselors. What these kids so much more need is access to mental health counseling, dealing with trauma, decent housing, their parents that have stable jobs. Why aren't we investing in that instead of making sure that we create highways to send children of color into the juvenile justice system and then funnel them into the criminal legal system?
Amy, you will love the fact that I actually held a contempt hearing in my court and threatened the superintendent and the area superintendents with that, because what they were doing is that they were just opening the back door and letting the troubled kids out after they took the count. And of course, the kids are out of school. There was no hearing, there's no process. They're out on the street, and of course, they're getting into trouble. They're being recruited by gang members. They're breaking into houses. They're doing all of these things. And so it caused quite a stir. It really caused quite a stir. And it was very serious because it was so apparent that that's what they were doing. Yeah. And any child that became problematic, they just wanted them out of the schools. And that is not the purpose of education. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, I'm watching. And they said, well, you can't lock us up. And I said, well, let's see.
Well, that's very interesting, sort of the power of what a judge can do in a space. And maybe not all judges actually take their role in that way, that seriously. Nusrat, what are you all doing at the ACLU of Illinois? How are you approaching these issues?
Well, we agree that police don't belong in schools. And we also agree with the judge that qualified immunity is a huge barrier to true accountability. And how can we reform systems that are premised on institutional and structural racism and gender bias unless we hold accountable officers who fail to live up to our values for fair and equitable policing that actually keeps people safe rather than criminalizing low-income communities, Black and Brown people, women of color, transgender people. And a key to that is enabling people to sue the police for misconduct when they violate constitutional rights. And so in this last legislative session, the ACLU was supporting a bill that would do just that. It hasn't passed, and we're continuing that fight because holding accountable officers who hurt people actually helps to keep us safe. That is critically important.
Can you explain a little bit more for our audience? Because we've got folks who are live streaming, taking it in on YouTube and whatnot, and they may not know what qualified immunity happens to be. So what is that? And what is this barrier?
Yeah, so qualified immunity is a judge-made doctrine that says that when a person sues the police for constitutional violations, like, for example, violating the Fourth Amendment right to reasonable search and seizures, which guards against excessive force. Say you are, subject to violence at a protest and you want to sue the police for that violence, vindicate your Fourth Amendment rights. Well, the police officer can raise qualified immunity and say, hey, listen, I might have done that, but I shouldn't be held liable because my conduct in that situation wasn't previously held by a court to violate the Constitution. And this doctrine has been extended by judges in cases after case after case, making it so difficult for a person to actually sue a police officer unless what happened to them happened in specific facts that have already been ruled upon in a previous case, which really subverts the entire purpose of having the Constitution, which is to say that there are principles like protection from excessive force that you should be able to vindicate, even if, for example, you were standing in front of a Burger King instead of in front of, a laundromat. And that is the kind of level of picayune detail that judges are often looking for when they're applying doctrines of qualified immunity. So really what a lot of folks are doing now in Illinois, advocates are calling for this, and other states as well, is saying, listen, we need people to be able to just enforce their constitutional rights. There's no debate that there's a protection against excessive force embedded in the Fourth Amendment. There's no debate that the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the law. And that means you shouldn't be targeted by police for a stop, a frisk, a search, a seizure because of your race, because of your gender. That these are norms we value because it actually helps keep our communities safe. Not being able to enforce them is making us less safe. And so that's a key component of what we're pushing for. We're also trying to get stricter standards on use of force. I mean, and for decades throughout the country, we've seen very lax standards around the use of force and deadly force, which have contributed to the police violence against communities of color, women of color that we've been talking about today. And so we have championed and pushed for clearer, cleaner standards that can guide officer conduct and also can be used to help hold officers accountable.
No, I was going to add to that because people will say, well, all right, it sounds like there are big judgments that come about. Judge Hatchett got a judgment in the Philando Castile case, but then Nusrat Choudhury just said that officers aren't having to pay. So where does the money come from?
Well, the money usually comes from insurance policies that cities and states take out to pay for these sorts of money judgments. And I will say, I was involved for many years with colleagues in litigation against the Milwaukee Police Department for stopping and frisking Black and Latinx people without justification and in ways that were racially biased. And those practices were happening at the same time that the city was paying out multi-million, tens of millions of dollars a year to settle horrific lawsuits involving horrific facts. You know, the case of Dontre Hamilton, who was shot by police officers, a person who was struggling with mental health issues while he was sleeping on a bench in the middle of a city park. Like, you can't even make up these stories. And so there's this tremendous disconnect between paying out these money judgments through reliance on insurance policies and these sorts of other mechanisms, and just actually looking at the conduct of the department and saying, this is not who we are. This is not what we want our country to be. This doesn't live up to our values. And I think we all agree that we want a country that is fair and provides equal justice. And that doesn't happen when we're not holding officers accountable for misconduct.
If I could just add a footnote to that too, that because there's not a national registry, that the officer in the Philando case, I'll use an example, sat at home for almost 11 months, full pay, and before the trial came on, but the union paid for all of this. They set up a GoFundMe fund, and so people were thinking that they're contributing to the GoFundMe. He's getting rich, the union pays for it, but there is nothing that stops him from going to work in another police department because we don't have a national registry. And that is a part of the federal legislation that they're proposing. And I would argue that until you tie federal funding to the accountability piece of cameras, body cameras, and reporting, that it is not going to get better. So, you know, I leave one department, the police, in the case I'm doing now, has had a horrible record. But yet he is still on the force because we don't share that information. And it just goes on and on and on in terms of accountability.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, this brings to mind what's happened in Rochester. And I'd like to get your responses to this because very recently there was both video and audio released involving a 9-year-old girl who's calling out, pleading for her father. Maybe you all have listened to this video, listened to this audio, and she's just saying that she wants her daddy. She wants her daddy. And it looks like there are about 6 squad cars that have appeared in this. And the girl is pepper sprayed. And at some point, the officer says to her, one of the officers says, you're acting like a child. And her response is, I am a child. You know, and when I hear what you're saying, Judge Hatchett, you know, that there is no database, there is no kind of national tracking, you know, how do we then think about what comes next in instances like that, where someone maybe is suspended, but another department someplace in the country doesn't know, or maybe they, happen to be fired, but, another place across the country, they don't know. And I'd like to add one more piece to that, because that's shocking, and she's 9, but there's so many instances of the kind of abuse that women experience with policing, sexual assaults on the side of the road. I mean, there's a whole genre of sexual assault in car stops. So what do we do about this?
So, I mean, I'll just piggybacking off of the horrible story that you just recounted, Michele. I mean, if we have a standard that is that force is not permitted unless it's necessary and proportional to a threat of imminent bodily harm, I don't see why you would be using tear gas or pepper spray on a 9-year-old. Like, how is that necessary or proportionate, right? It just doesn't meet the standard. And that's the standard that we're fighting for in Illinois and that other advocates are fighting for across the country. So that's one, I think, critically important piece. I also just want to underscore that we are living through a historic reckoning with racial justice. And changing the way that police operate, transforming the police so that communities feel safe and are a part of that process of keeping themselves safe and protected from police abuse is not going to be solved by any one law, any one reform, any one lawsuit. It's going to be solved by an intergenerational movement. And so part of what we've been fighting for as well is challenging the militaristic policing that we saw unleashed on peaceful protesters in Chicago and Illinois. I watched that video of the armed riot of the Capitol, and I saw a permissive attitude towards armed people trying to thwart the functioning of the US democratic process. But what I saw this summer in Chicago were peaceful protesters who were met with tear gas, pepper spray, with kettling, which means trapping protesters into an area and then ordering them to disperse, but not letting them go, baton strikes to the head, people who were recording police having their cameras and bicycles taken away. That is not appropriate. And we need here a social movement to push forward all of these efforts, to sustain this effort so we can uproot the gender inequity and racism that is involved in too much of the policing that we see. And it's not the policing that some police even want. As I think Deirdre has mentioned, there are people who are looking at this and saying this is not who we are. And so we need to make sure that racial justice protest can go forward as it wants to, so we can hear those calls and respond to those demands.
And
right,
I would love to hear from you, and then Deidre. So yeah, Amy.
I was just going to say, I think that the solution is not one thing. It is going to be multi-pronged, and it has to get and go to the very root of the culture of policing, which has allowed the brutalization of Black communities. And quite frankly, I live in Washington, D.C. I saw what happened, and I've been to many, many protests in which the police were very brutal. I participated in, and then to see a complete 360-degree switch. So we know that they can do it. They choose not to do it. And that is because they are not being held accountable outside of themselves. So part of this culture change is going to have to be more and consistent and strong accountability from the community itself. No institution of coercive power can actually police itself. We see that in corrections, we see that in the police. These are institutions that run amok when they think that they can. And so we have to put firm guardrails on them and make the community the ultimate arbiter of what they can and cannot do, how they are held accountable, and what they prioritize. Clearly, none of that is happening in almost any corner of America right now.
It's not.
Deidre, so what do we learn from your film? What will people see this evening? And I'd like to tell those who are reaching us via YouTube and also via Zoom, this is the time now where if you have questions, please put them in, please send those to us in the Q&A. But Deidre, what do we learn from your film in relation to all of this? You're muted, Deidre.
Sorry. So I don't think there's any question that the film comes out against incremental reform. I mean, they've been trying first with Chief Arto and then with the current Chief Rondo for a long time to reform the Minneapolis Police Department. And that George Floyd could be killed at the end of that, I think really shows that I agree with everybody. It's going to take major systemic changes around accountability, around a systemically racist criminal justice system. I think that one of the things that I really think about is who are police officers, right? And can they be trained to live up to the kinds of ideals that, you know, Judge Hatchett, you're talking about, and Amy and Nusrat, who are these people, right? And I absolutely believe that we should have a different kind of requirement and standard for who these people are. I'm not sure you can train people to care about communities, understand trauma, to be really thinking about, not about enforcing laws as the primary goal, but about protecting communities, particularly of color, but all communities. And I think one of the women in the film, but all of them, Sergeant Alice White, exemplifies. There's one traffic stop that she does in the film that exemplifies what it would mean to have a person there whose primary goal is not just law enforcement, but to have this interaction with this person be an experience where they feel protected, right? She's stopping someone and she's concerned about the trauma that this man may feel having just been stopped by the police. I do think, you know, right now I just read that the Minneapolis Police Department, the city council, is thinking about giving money to recruitment. And what I would hate is for recruitment to be done the way it's always been done, right? Going a lot to the military, you know, this idea that you should be brawny and strong, like that's the image. Who are we attracting to policing? And I think we need to be attracting a very, very different kind of person with a very different idea of what their job is. Your job is to protect communities, right? And, you know, just one statistics, you know, women just on an economic level, we have you know, money needs to be spread out. And obviously communities need money for mental health and housing and education and everything. It's cheaper to hire women. Why? Because they don't use excessive force and they're in the same levels and you don't have to do those kinds of payouts. But, you know, when I say women, I don't think it's just women who are going to go in and keep the system the way it is. What I think we need to be is attracting women like you all women like Stacey Abrams, people who are thinking about how can we transform this institution held up by obviously major systemic changes around accountability. And one last thing I'll say about accountability, one thing that was really shocking that I saw when I was in Minneapolis was to see a chief decide to fire a police officer. This person is using too much excessive force. I am firing you. And to have that person back on the job 2 weeks later because the union grieved it. I think that is a system that is completely dysfunctional and works against any reform, right? Until police officers cannot have that kind of power behind them to get back on the job, I don't think much is going to change.
Well, picking up on that, so what is it that we're seeing in terms of trends with police unions? Is that anything that your organizations are involved in? So Amy, are you all looking at that issue? Nusrat, is that something that you all are taking up in your approach? Judge Hatchett, have you been thinking about that?
You know, we think a lot about police union contracts because they do seek to shield officers from accountability. You know, often police union contracts will say things like an officer who's involved in a shooting doesn't have to give a statement for 24 hours. You know, for example, they may prohibit or permit multiple officers who are involved in an incident of violence against members of the public to actually talk to each other before they give their statements, which also can undermine accountability. So there are these real concerns that the contracts are not being used for their intended purpose, which was to advocate for collective bargaining rights, which people have a right to in this country, but instead to really shield people from officers, from accountability for misconduct. So there's a real movement. There's a lot of energy and organizing around people in Chicago and elsewhere wanting more transparency around how these contracts are negotiated, what positions governments are taking in those processes so that they're positions that require or promote compliance with constitutional norms. In Chicago, we have a consent decree against the Chicago Police Department. It's the result of a Department of Justice investigation into racial disparities and extraordinary excessive use of force by the Chicago Police, as well as 2 separate lawsuits by community organizations seeking accountability for excessive force and harm against people with disabilities. And the consent decree requires the city of Chicago to take best efforts when it's negotiating these contracts to make sure that the contracts comport with accountability and with constitutional requirements. We are still waiting to see if that is what the city is going to do. So all eyes are on the city of Chicago as it's engaging in that process.
And the only way that's going to change is that that's going to have to be consistent with a lot of cities and a lot of contract negotiations. In the Philando case, he did not have to take a statement. He did not have to give a statement. They actually had people go to his house to quote unquote protect him. I am still of the opinion that they were there coaching him. And he, of course, got to talk to the other officer involved because the union carries such a big stick in that situation. And they were very, 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 very involved from the very beginning of the situation. And they insisted that he be paid for leave. It's just, it's atrocious. And it needs to be.
And it's very common around the country. And I say this as a former labor lawyer who is pro-union, but we don't.
Me too. I used to be a labor lawyer in my old days. I was
a union should not be about protecting bad people and dangerous people on the job. That's bad for everybody. Nobody wants to work with somebody who is immediately going to draw their gun. That creates such a dangerous situation. And I'm afraid that a lot of the union contracts have been incentivized towards not what is good working conditions, but what is going to protect bad people who don't deserve to have that job anymore. So that needs to end, absolutely. But I do think that there are political issues here that need to be exposed to the public. Quite frankly, when I dealt with unions, correctional unions, oftentimes those negotiations didn't even happen with management. They happened outside at politics. Directly with the governor. So the accountability actually wasn't even within the institutions themselves. So
can you talk a little bit more about that for people who don't know? And to just be clear, when some people think about unions, they think about protecting electricians and they think about protecting plumbers and others. But of course, these are not people who are wielding guns when they come into your house to fix, the sink, or to fix the wiring. These are not people who might, possibly harm you in some aggressive kind of way. So there are some distinctions. And can you tell us a little bit more about the politics?
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that some of the only strong unions left in this country are law enforcement. Is not lost on me. The coercive agents of the state have more power than the SEIU or the AFL-CIO. And there are good reasons to have organizing, and collective bargaining is important, and worker protections is definitely very, very important. But they shouldn't be the be all end all when it comes to sacrificing public safety, because that is the purpose of law enforcement. And unfortunately, we see incentivized politics oftentimes getting in the way of what's actually good for public safety. So when it is in the interests of the mayor or the governor or the executive to get those union votes, sometimes those contracts actually have some very irrational provisions that don't allow for the kind of accountability that the public needs. So we shouldn't be sacrificing the public good in order for some politicians to get more votes. That's just, that is unacceptable. And especially because the public doesn't even know about it.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing, which is that he's since retired, but the Minneapolis head of the union, Bob Kroll, was very, very clear all the way through that he didn't believe in de-escalation, right? He doesn't think that makes cops safe, right? And so he's like, I ask them, I make them, I tell them. And, a good cop is an aggressive cop. This is a man who is was and probably still is extremely proud of the fact that, he's gotten a lot, that he has a long history of police misconduct, because that's him being a good cop. And to me, that's sending out a very crazy kind of schizophrenic mixed message. Do we want to reform our police departments, right? Or are we going to allow this sort of regressive, Trump, you don't even hold somebody's head as they're getting into the car. I think, we have to really look at all the avenues. And I really agree with everyone. It is so, these systems are not functioning, right? So that's why when I say we need women, and particularly Black women, it's never siloed from these bigger changes. But I think at the end of the day, we do want to invite and inspire people who have a different kind of ideals and a different consciousness about diverse communities and about care, right? Those should be the people protecting us.
So
can I build off on that with one comment,
yeah.
Michelle? It's just also to say that what needs to be part of this conversation is also just removing police interactions from so much of daily life, because for Black and Brown communities, things that other communities do all of a sudden become criminalized. Why are police giving so many tickets for low-level issues like vehicle equipment violations, like just very minor things, like driving on a suspended license, for example, some of you may know, is one of the largest reasons why police officers stop people on the street in traffic stops. And often people's licenses are suspended because they couldn't pay other tickets. So it's a crime of poverty, really. Like, why is that even criminalized? And why is that something that then could lead to jail time? So I really think it's important to take police out of the equation for much of how life is policed, because really we should not have police dealing with folks with behavioral and mental health crisis. We should have trained medical, psychological professionals who are able to handle these situations in ways that merit resolution that's not using force.
Well,
I have to seconds. I know we're out of time.
We have to actually wrap up soon because we're reaching that time. We could continue on. But on that point, and Judge Hatchett, we just lost your camera, but on that point, you see these instances of children, and as we're talking about girls and women, little girls, 4, 5 years old, being handcuffed at school, being placed in squad cars at school. And we know very well that it's, a bad day, or what would be called a bad hair day. That's not something exclusive to Black and Latinx children at all, but it's stunning the incidences of the arrest of those kids at school. So we have to wrap up. I am so sorry, but quick final last comments. Is there some form of hope that you see coming in this space? This is our last quick round robin. Spaces of hope, things that you're thinking about or that your organizations are working on that could help move the needle here? I'll start with you, Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, despite the fact that this is a very historically tough time in America, since the success of the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund the police movement, space has opened up. We are talking about solutions and culture change and shifting our paradigm in a way that was not possible at this time last year. So I am extremely hopeful, because not only do more people know the need, but they have the power and the impetus to actually make the change that needs to happen. So let's go to it.
I'm encouraged. I think that we are at a critical turning point in this country. And I don't think that we can go back. I mean, I think we have to keep the momentum. And I just want to thank everybody. Really, I am in such appreciation and awe of the great work that each of you is doing. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you. And what an honor to be among you all as a storyteller. But I agree. I mean, the moment of reckoning is here, and thank God, we just can't take our foot off the gas. I do think this question of gender in policing has never really gotten traction. There have been people for 30 years who go into police departments after, people were killed by the police and saying, have you ever thought about, the United States gives money to other countries to have more women in peacekeeping. And I'm hoping that that's the time for that conversation is beginning to happen and women are just an emblem of a different style and a different approach to what has been a very brutal institution.
And Nusrat.
Deidre, share with us so that we can put out on social media so everybody can watch you tonight.
PBS Tonight.
Great. It'll be on Independent Lens, PBS Independent Lens, but I'll send you a link. Thank you so
Please.
much.
I
Yeah,
can put it on social
I'd love to
media.
get your feedback.
And Nusrat.
And I will say, I think like I am simultaneously outraged and optimistic, because I really do see the hope in the tens of thousands of people, the hundreds of thousands of people who mobilized over the summer and continuing to fight for racial justice and equity in policing. And I think that those voices are going to be heard. And I think part of what our job is to do as advocates is to make sure that dissent is patriotic and it is viewed as such, because we've never made movement in this country towards equity if it wasn't for people who took the courage and to dissent and to say the hard truths that needed to be said.
Couldn't have closed on a more powerful note. So we want to thank you all for joining in and with us today as we talked about race and sex and policing in America. This is a broader and deeper conversation to be had, but we're very happy to have been able to have this with you all. And the ACLU of Minnesota is committed to further engagement on these very important issues and continuing to address them while we focus also on women. These are issues that are intersectional and that must be understood as intersectional. And we'll be lifting up the socioeconomic aspects of these issues too. Race, sex, LGBTQ, equality, socioeconomics, they're all together. And for our listening, viewing audience, if there are any questions that you had which were not addressed, I'm going to provide those to the panelists and we will email you back. I want to thank you all. Thank you so much for joining today and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin. Thank you. Thank all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cross again.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.